Hello, I'm Richard Reardon from the University of Idaho. You can see my name and affiliation on this first slide. I was going to put myself in as a talking head in the corner, but I've always found when I've processed those kinds of videos as a consumer, I've always found that to be kind of distracting. So I decided against it. So you'll be able to hear me, and if you ever want to see who I am and what I look like, you can go to the university's website, and I think there's a smiling version of me there somewhere. But for now, and for these two videos, you'll just hear my voice. So this video is about human relations. Human relations in the workplace is the title of one of our 4-credit classes, and that's actually my area of specialization within organizational behavior. I'm a social psychologist, cognitive psychologist by training, and study human memory and social cognition. But my applied area is in organizational behavior and organizational relationships. Human relations is not just a topic, it's also a movement, and we'll talk a little bit about where that movement comes from. It sounds like it's a soft, sort of fuzzy, psycho-babble kind of a thing, but in fact it's actually a term from business. And it certainly draws in a lot of people from the behavioral sciences besides people from business schools, but it's a business term as people started recognizing the importance of relationships, human relationships in the workplace. So we'll be talking about a number of things, including where the human relations movement comes from, what the context was at the time when the movement originated, some of the difficulties of early systems, and some of the people who are pretty famous now in historical terms who weighed in on this, and where we are. We'll wrap it up with this in the second video with some of the things that we focus on today in a typical human relations course. So we'll start with historical background. Why do we need historical background? Well, it's good to know where we came from and why. Obviously, when a movement originates, like the human relations movement, it's in response to something. It's in response to, perhaps in this case, a system that really wasn't working very well or wasn't working optimally. So we'll talk a little bit about what those problems were, and we'll talk about some of the thinking involved at the time, and the way we sort of deal with conceptual skills in the workplace now, and how we reframe those. There has always been a recognition that social, political, and economic forces have mattered. What's interesting about the human relations movement and human relations as a perspective is that it focuses on those in particular, as well as the interpersonal day-to-day relationships in the workplace. So what are the forces in general that affect organizations and management? Well, values, needs, standards of behavior, political forces. You just have to look around in our own country, and you can see how things can swing back and forth, and things can get hot and cool, and there can be anger, and there can be contentment, and there can be optimism, and there can be pessimism, and so on. And political forces are tied to those issues, and so those kinds of things matter. They matter even in the workplace. They can affect workplace relationships as well. Economic forces, obviously how people respond during tough times matters. How people respond during very abundant times matters. I'll give you an example. In 2007, 2008, when we had this sort of crash, for lack of a better term, one of the things that I observed with my students who were in the workplace is that a lot of their bosses, a lot of their supervisors, fell into a more autocratic kind of a system. Instead of engaging them, they became even bossier. And I don't know if that was generally true or if it was just our local area, but it was something that was striking to me at the time. And we'll talk a little bit about what that kind of a system was, and perhaps we'll touch again on exactly why supervisors at the time felt the need to become a little more autocratic. So this gives you a little bit of a time perspective. The classical viewpoint of organizational management captures, from the 1870s. Basically, Frederick Taylor is tied to that era, and there are other approaches, pretty autocratic style, in the sense that you were lucky to have a job, and you did what you were told, and you could be fired at will, and so on. It was basically a very top-down kind of a system. And the loyalty, you'll see in a second, the loyalty of individual employees was to sometimes an individual, their immediate supervisor or the overall supervisor of the organization. Remember, when we're talking about the 1870s, we're only a little bit away from a sort of a almost a feudal system, where the landowners and head merchants or the chief merchants in the community ran everything, and everybody was beholden to them. And so that was the era that a lot of our current systems have emerged from. The humanistic perspective was the beginning of the humanistic or the human relations movement in the 30s, in the last century, and we'll talk about the key study there. And almost all of these approaches build on earlier ones. So, for example, there are some elements of the classical approach that are absorbed into the humanistic perspective. Humanistic perspective has impact on modern management sciences and systems theory and all of those. So you could look at each of these previous systems as contributing to the systems that follow. It's never totally throw away one of the older systems. You just take the best pieces and keep moving them forward. When you finally get up to, and I hope my cursor shows you, the technology-driven workplace, which is we're still not exactly sure what that's going to finally look like, but it's sort of an interesting perspective. The learning organization, organizations where every employee is never at a stationary point. You're never in the same job for decades. The assumption is that you will learn as the organization learns. You might move up, you might move laterally, but the organization is one that adjusts, and that's built into the system. TQM is a term you've heard about, total quality management. And so you'll see this sort of evolution from here in the sort of classical perspective up toward learning organizations, but you'll find that this humanistic movement is quite well represented in these latter two systems, I guess, technology-driven workplace and the learning organization workplace. So the classical perspective, classical meaning it seems to go forever until the last 150 years or so. It's a rational approach, scientific approach, as Frederick Taylor made it in the latter part of that sort of very, very long era. Scientific management was the term he used. They could be bureaucratic, but there's a little bit of a spin on that bureaucracy and what bureaucracies do. And the administrative principles associated with that tend to be, again, fairly directive and top-down. Frederick Taylor, and you can see his era, 50s, the middle 1850s into the early part of the last century. And he's often portrayed as a kind of as a standard autocrat, unfeeling. And what you should know about Frederick Taylor is, yes, he did believe that we supervisors know what's best, and you will, if you work as one of our supervisees, you will do what you're told. You will pay attention to your supervisors. You will do as you've been trained to do and as you're told to do, and everybody is better because of it. Because what he added was that this constant, what a typical science lab would do, and that is we do something and we keep collecting data to see how well we're doing it. That's the sort of scientific element of his approach, is that you're always assessing, you're always measuring success. And as long as if I'm the supervisor, I take that data and convert it into workplace changes, process changes, hiring practices, then we will all be better off, including the people who work for me. So the people who work for me, my supervisees, who may look at me as kind of the autocrat, are better off if I behave that way, as long as I'm constantly altering the system, tweaking it, upgrading it to maximize performance. We all get better off, supervisors and supervisees. So he wasn't heartless, although he's often portrayed that way. It's just that he thought that managers and supervisors know best, and that is that. Built into that, of course, is that you reward workers. And that's, again, the sort of heart part of this model, is that you do take into account performance, and you reward performance. So some contributions, some criticisms demonstrated the importance of compensation, of course. The scientific study, you study tasks, you study jobs, and you relate those things to performance. The importance of training. training programs within organizations. Almost any major organization now has internal training programs. But what it didn't do is take into account the social context and what workers might want, what they might need, what the sort of loftier goals they may have for themselves. Didn't take into account individual differences. Everybody is a cog in scientific management, and what we know is that some people do better in some circumstances than others. And the key in personnel, for example, is to match people, match their skills to the job's demands. And again, workers are uninformed and they really don't matter too much. I mean, they matter because they do their work, of course, but in terms of their opinions about how things should be done, that's, it's almost parental or feudal in attitude. So justifiably, this is the kind of thing that others were responding to, these sort of negative pieces. The 1800s were really a sort of a time when a lot of things were happening in terms of the sort of scientific management, like Frederick Taylor, but also Max Weber weighing in on what bureaucracies are and what they do. And I mentioned before that it was pretty common for people, if you work in an organization, your loyalty is to an individual or to a set of individuals, not to the mission. And I think those of you in organizations now understand that, in fact, that is usually the central organizing theme work for workers, is what are we supposed to do and what are we supposed to accomplish as an organization. That's our starting point now. But starting point in the old days was you're loyal to the person who hired you or to that person's supervisor. And so that was kind of a change. Max Weber wrote nice things about bureaucracies. Bureaucracy is a term we use almost like a swear word today. We say bureaucratic and we almost spit it out. But in fact, bureaucracies are necessary, and that's what Max Weber pointed out, is that you can't have an organization without a bureaucracy. You need that layer of managers. You need to distribute leadership a little bit. You need to have boots on the ground close to certain processes, and so you have to have these sort of bureaucratic organizations. Bureaucracies themselves are not bad. It's when they are designed badly. So a bureaucratic system that works well, we don't even notice it. It just works well. And we sort of complain about bureaucracies when they weren't well designed and they aren't functioning well. So it's just a reminder that you have to have sort of layers, especially as organizations get bigger. Otherwise, you get span of control. A span of control issue is, for example, when one supervisor has too many people to oversee and so can't keep track of all of them. You get inefficient division of labor. Those are things that were studied and observed in the probably mid to late 1800s and into the 1900s as well. So those are those kinds of terms that we just generally accept these days, that supervisors can only supervise so many people. And that you want to divide labor in some cases in very complex organizations. That was again sort of a hot era for that kind of thinking. And Max Weber basically saying, if you're going in that direction, you better have a system in your organization that can handle that. And we call those things bureaucracies, and they're useful and necessary, and sometimes they're badly designed. So, looking at organizations as whole systems, they're almost organically. It's like the human body. If one part is damaged, it affects every part, and so that's also part of that era. That organizations have that sort of organic quality to them. That they are, yes, they're a bunch of pieces and lots of individuals and different processes, but the impact of one badly performing person or some subset of people in the organization that are performing optimally, the impact is broader than just those sets of individuals. So bureaucracies. This is just a little bit of a scheme about bureaucracies. I've mentioned division of labor and lines of responsibility, hierarchies of authority, personnel selected, promoted based on what they can do, their qualifications, not on favoritism. These are things you can see are still ideals in the workplace. We still like to think that these things operate, and they do in most organizations, a lot of organizations, not optimally sometimes, but they're certainly things that people strive for, if in fact they don't always get there perfectly in some sort of perfect tidiness. They're goals and that you should strive for. You may not always get there Administrative acts and decisions are recorded, and that's necessary, for example, in scientific management. That's a little element from scientific management that's moved forward a little bit, that, keeping track of successes and failures, and how relating changes you've made as an administrator to the outcomes in terms of what the organization's mission is. All right. Management and ownership are a little separate. Most modern corporations, for example, the owners, who are the stockholders, or even the major stockholders, operate through boards. They don't directly, not every company, not any large organization is the owner sitting right over your shoulder. Some smaller organizations, that's still the case. But as you move up and become a bureaucratic organization, that is one that has layers of authority, then you really need to sometimes keep the ownership separate, or the ownership sits at the top. But you need skilled people to manage that first layer of management. And it may not be the owner. Managers are subject to rules. Managers aren't. That's not something people explicitly considered until the mid 1800s. That's that part of the acknowledgement of the role of human relations in the workplace is that managers can't operate without some sort of oversight themselves. In some cases, that oversight originates in the people they manage, in terms of feedback about supervisors, or the manager's manager noticing how the manager is behaving and rating that, just like that manager is also looking at his or her supervisees. So it's managers have their own rules. They cannot just run roughshod over employees or each other. So these are some of the big names from that era that I haven't already mentioned. Henry Fayol, Mary Parker, Chester Barnard, and you can see those names if you want to just go on Wikipedia. By the way, I will recommend Wikipedia. I go there all the time. Always just be cautious that sometimes they get things wrong. But it's a pretty good source for just quick information. And you can see these names there if you wanted to. But you see a shift in sort of how organizations are thought of with these folks and others, right? That it's the organization, not the individuals or individual. It's management functions should be specialized. For example, you have planners, you've got supervisors who do certain kinds of things. You've got events. You've got different tasks. Financial tasks should be under the control of financial people, and so on. Essentially, as organizations become complex, you need specialization, and those specialists have to be allowed to do their job and control their shops, and taking good human relations into account. But this is a matter of sort of dividing labor along functional lines. So this is just a nice chart that captures the kinds of management principles that still survive, that are still useful in modern human relations in the workplace, but really have their origins as specific topics of observation and study in the mid 1800s. That labor, we can be efficient if we divide tasks. That authority is important. It has to be judicious, and we'll see that in the sort of humanistic influences that you get with the human relations movement. There has to be some discipline within the system. Right? And you'd like to think that the people managing the organization at the top and the layers closer to the top are all speaking with one voice. There's a kind of a unity of command, that everybody's moving in the same direction, that everywhere, at every level, individual interest is present, but it's subordinated to the overall mission of the organization, that people are properly compensated for the work they do. Centralization, where it's necessary, is available. So for services, for certain resources, having that ability to centralize is very useful. Let's see, order, equity, scalar chains. These are all have to do with how labor proceeds across time, and how the outcomes proceed across time. And so I will leave those for you. But essentially, a scalar chain refers to a chain of command where very hierarchical. One person passes on information and directions to the next person, to the next person, to the next person, and so on, all the way down. And some systems that actually is the best way to run it. And if you're in certain, for example, military systems where a chain of command has to be strict because the mission requires it, then that's the kind of system you have. In an organization with a bunch of professionals, engineers, you might have a more centralized system, a little more equity. There's of course order, but what you have is a system where everybody is equal in a sense professionally, although some may have, at least in terms of rank, but some may have qualifications that are different from others, and everybody can contribute, and everybody benefits. You like stability, of course. You want people to be in an organization. People forget that it costs to replace. You see that all the time. People make that error. They decide that they can remove somebody, or somebody leaves and they cannot replace, or it takes them a while to replace, and that's loss of productivity, loss of outcome. And so having a staff that's stable is a good idea. That's often a symptom for an organization that's in trouble, is when they're having difficulty retaining staff. Rewarding initiative and having people, so again, in esprit de corps, people loyal to the organization, loyal to the outcomes of the organization, and there are lots of ways of instituting esprit de corps. Sometimes the organization just demands it because it's a great organization. There are organizations that just people join because they want to be involved in that activity, especially in the nonprofit sector. And whether it's an art, human services, or any of the things that nonprofits do. And so they start with the beginning of esprit de corps, and then it's kind of up to the supervisors, managers, and other coworkers to maintain it rather than lose it. Here's Mary Parker Follett, and you can see about her time of influence, usually probably the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Goal setting, the importance of goal setting, having layers of goals, superordinate goals that reduce conflict. You'll see that captured experimentally by Muzafer Sharif almost, probably 80 years later in the Robbers Cave study, where he demonstrated with kids, frankly, how having a superordinate goal can minimize conflict or raise people out of a conflicted situation. So it was, as I said, ignored at the time, but became the cornerstone of Sharif's work, and now is broadly accepted, and it's something you do, right? Create a common emergency, for example, that people have to respond to, create a common enemy, or a common outcome that all of us could get on the page for, and get on the page about, I suppose, is a better way of putting that. So very important influence, and not remembered so much for it. Muzafer Sharif, though, is, and I think he certainly gave her credit for her work. Of course, the scientific management approach to this very same kind of problem is just tell them to stop, or fire one or something. So you've got a conflict in organizations, you just replace people, or you yell at them or something. You tell them don't do that anymore, and that's a problem. You can see that all of you have been in organizations of some sort, and you know that that's just not a successful way to deal with conflict. Whereas common goals, emphasizing common goals, sometimes restructuring the organization to get to that point of having common goals. So you've got two groups conflicting in your organization, you create an administrative change that has them working on the same project, and so you can minimize goals that way. Minimize conflicts that way. So you'll find that, and again, this is the importance of people versus engineering techniques, is sort of that early stage of recognize that kind of importance. Chester Barnard, again, roughly the same era, perhaps a little bit later. The informal organizations that exist within more formal organizations. And those can be bad, those can be good. It just depends on how they're managed, what supervisors do with those. A clique in an organization can be a bad thing unless it's managed well and is applied to a task, for example. These will occur in organizations. You cannot stop subgroups from forming on social bases or task bases. The acceptance theory authority is really that, and this is where Bernard probably gets beyond what a lot of you would accept and what a lot of people in the workplace accept right now, that people that people who work for supervisors, have a total free will to decide how to follow, what to follow, and of course that can't work. It certainly are a lot of organizations that that would simply disintegrate if, in fact, there wasn't a reasonable chain of command. The question is, how broad does that chain have to be, and what are the relationships among the layers of the chain of command? And so Barnard may have been overstating on purpose, just to get people out of that way of thinking as all leaders and supervisors as authoritarians. So he might have been overstating it to make a point, but it's clear you cannot, if you cannot have people sort of choosing which orders to follow, because it can affect overall productivity. However, if the point is you've got to give people a voice, then there's something to that, and I think that's generally accepted now in most workplaces. Now, the human relations movement emerges from that history, and the recognition, and you can see it kind of emerging as in the things we've talked about, in recognition of that the important thing, it's not sometimes how the widget is made, but it's the issue may be how do the people making the widget get along with each other, and how do they get along with their supervisors? How do the supervisors get along with the supervisees? How does everybody in the organization relate to outsiders like vendors and customers, people that you're providing services to, people who are connoisseurs who are there visiting your museum if it's a nonprofit in the arts community. So those are the relationships that matter, and that's what the humanistic perspective brought to bear, and what the human relations movement was designed to address. So what did the human relations movement try to focus on? And at the very end of the second video, we'll talk about some of the very specific kinds of things that the human relations in the workplace emphasis takes into account. But right now, basically, broad strokes, satisfaction of employees. Their basic needs are central to their overall productivity. So one of the first things you might want to take into account is, are they appropriately paid? Are they appropriately taken, is their health issue something that can be, either you work with them in terms of their time and days off, or you provide them with the appropriate medical help when needed. And that goes all the way back even to the early factories of the 100 years ago. There would be, for example, a medical team on board, on site, but it could show up as insurance. It could show up as allowing people to work certain hours and compensating them for for the extra hours they work, so they can make up time lost and so on. It's it's those kinds of recognitions or those kinds of issues. This is probably one of the most, maybe, let's see, in terms of it cutting across disciplines, the Hawthorne studies may be one of the most famous studies in all of psychology, organizational psychology, sociology, business. I mean, it's incredibly important story is told by the Hawthorne studies. They're called studies because there were several teams. Sometimes the Hawthorne study is presented as a single study, but actually you'll find that there are groups of people who are watching this workplace over time, and so Hawthorne studies is a more correct way of describing what happened there. It was a 10-year study, 4 experimental, 3 control groups, 5 different tests were administered, and not only that, but just the general observation and note keeping by, in a sort of anthropological sense as well. So what did these investigations show? Well, by the way, Hawthorne is this is a location for Western Electric factory. Western Electric Company was the hardware arm of Bell Telephone. So back in the day, some of you won't remember this, but a few of you may, or perhaps you remember it from a history class. There was a benign monopoly in this country, a phone company. And in some rural areas, there'd be phone co-ops, but there was a phone company. It was Bell Telephone, AT&T, and they did it all. Nobody owned the lines in their own home, right? And you didn't even own your own phone. When I was a kid, you didn't own your own phone. You got it from the phone company when you subscribed for service. It's considered a benign monopoly because, in fact, they kept costs pretty modest and they didn't gouge you as the sole provider. But clearly, it violated some people's idea of monopolistic um, control. So, in fact, it was broken up, and now that's why you have all the Baby Bell companies, which all have different names now. And even Western Electric, the hardware company, was broken up into a couple of different organizations. But they're the ones who made the apparatus, the phone sets, the switches, the circuitry, the sort of hardware that went with telephones. So that's what the Hawthorne studies, they were in that kind of site. Right? So, and by the way, the finding that's often cited in when a textbook has like 3 lines to talk about the Hawthorne studies, what they sometimes report is that, oh yeah, when workers realized they were being, when you made a change in the workplace, productivity went up. So if you made the light brighter, if you added music, then productivity went up. And what they don't report is that sometimes when you reduced the illumination, or you reduced music, or any change in the workplace, productivity went up. So it was an odd finding, but and that's why, again, you have sometimes drilling down more deeply into this study is useful. It turns out, if you wanted a summary statement, workers responded to anything that made it seem as if they were being observed, as if they were not in a bad sense of being observed, but as if they mattered. It's a better way of putting that. So they improved productivity when they thought others were paying attention to them and were interested in their outcomes. So no matter what you did, if you did something that seemed unpleasant, even like make it a little bit darker, or a little bit cooler, or a little bit, let's say if you change it, the timing of certain tasks, and so the improvement in productivity would sometimes jump up a bit, and that was because they knew you were trying to do something. So they were responding to this attempt by the researchers and the managers there to find out what made them produce more. So it was kind of a strange way, by showing workers that you care how well they're doing and how well they're doing their jobs, they do their jobs better. It's and there a lot of other things happened to that experiment. They were interviewed what they thought about certain processes in the workplace. So they went to certain places on the lines and said, what do you think? Could this be better? How could it be better? And so on. So taking their opinions and their input into account was also part of the sort of overall study. So basically, conclusion is almost anything that had to do with human relations in the workplace improved productivity. And that is that sense that people were being paid attention to as if they really were important and had something to say about what was going on in terms of process, in terms of assembly of devices, in terms of coordination of effort, and so on. So that was that was not the beginning of it. That was really the study that when people, because you can see that people have this sense that it's workplace relationships that matter, how people relate to each other, supervisors, supervisees, co-workers with each other. But the Western Electric study was initially, I think, to confirm that, to explore that. And the outcome was very positive. That is, productivity went up when these relationship issues were taken explicitly into account and addressed in terms of how people related to each other, in terms of instructions and training given to supervisors and to their supervised, and how jobs should be designed to meet these sort of higher level needs that workers have to feel like they're doing something important. And who wants to be in a workplace where, yeah, I'm paid pretty well, but I'd also like to believe that what I'm doing matters, that we turn out something that's of high quality. And even if I'm not paid as well as I think I should be, at least I can take that home with me at night, that sense that, yeah, but we did good work today. And there's what we produced in terms of services or widgets, that was high quality, and I can take pride in what I did there. So that wraps up the first part of this, and the reason I'm breaking it into two is because it's just faster to save these files. There's not as much interaction in this kind of a presentation as I would like, as if we were doing it in lecture hall. So the videos themselves will be a little bit shorter because we're missing some of that interaction, but I think you'll get a sense of what this field is like, and I invite any of you interested in if you happen to be going back to the university and are interested, this is a real course, and I spent an entire semester on these topics in that 3-credit, 4-credit class. So if you have a friend or relative who's interested in organizational behavior as a major, we have a program in that area, and we spend a lot of time on this very topic. So I'll adjourn now, and we'll come back in the second part and start with Maslow's hierarchy of needs and take it through to some of the very specific issues that we consider in human relations in the workplace.